Well, good morning. Good morning, good morning. If you'll open up to the book of Ruth. How many of you read Ruth in preparation for today? All of Ruth? All of Ruth. Ruth is a wonderful book, isn't it, June?
Yes.
Yes, it is. It's June's favorite book. This is not why we're doing it, but it's her favorite book nonetheless.
That and Revelation.
That and Revelation, that's true. So, today, introduction to the book of Ruth. We're going to go through this. We're going to fly right over the top of it like an airplane. We're going to look and see all we can see about the book of Ruth before we get started on chapter 1 next week. And if you've heard any of my introductory messages, you've heard them all. Right, Jeff? Pretty much. So, we're going to go through Ruth today on an introductory level, and I've entitled the series of Ruth, Nothing Insignificant. Nothing insignificant. The U.S. News and World Report, commenting on a delay in the Space Shuttle Columbia's second flight, pointed out that little things have often been the cause of big difficulties in the space program. The reason for the postponement was a clogged hydraulic system filter. Officials reported that the 5 quarts of oil needed for a change was worth only about $25. Yet the setback cost American taxpayers approximately $3 million a day. On another occasion, a costly satellite was lost because of a punctuation mark omitted from its computer program. And the cause for aborting an Apollo 13 moon landing in 1970 was a short circuit caused by a piece of wire worth about 50 cents. There's nothing insignificant about any of those things. You think, oh, just 50 cents, that's not a big deal. Yeah, it's not insignificant, though, when it ends up costing us $3 million a day. Nothing insignificant. Does anybody know or have heard of Charles Spurgeon? Charles Spurgeon, the beloved prince of preachers of a different generation. When Spurgeon was a teenager, he served as an assistant teacher in a school in Newmarket, Cambridgeshire, kept by John Swindell. The cook of the house was Mary King, a devout Christian. When Spurgeon was experiencing deep conviction, he talked with her, and she explained what she knew of the Word. Spurgeon wrote, "From her I got all the theology I ever needed." Mary King is one of those forgotten heroes of church history who influenced such a mighty man of God. Sometimes we think we're insignificant, we don't really do much for the kingdom. Who am I? I'm just a lowly grocery store employee. Maybe you felt that way, Maggie. What purpose do I have in this life? What good am I? Mary King, just a cook. Just an insignificant cook, right, June? What good am I? What good am I going to do in this life? I'm just an insignificant pawn in the midst of this great big world out there. And the book of Ruth reminds us that there's nothing insignificant. There's nobody who is insignificant. And every one of us play an important role in the program of God, down to grocery store workers and even cooks and everybody in between. Every single one of us is needed, valuable, and important. Charles Spurgeon was a great man of God, influenced heavily by this Mary King, who was a cook. Influenced somebody who ended up influencing millions of people. Even to this day, the name Charles Spurgeon is recognized and revered. And he got his influence from Mary King. As we begin the book of Ruth, you may wonder what's so special about this book. This book has some interesting history to show and to prove that nothing is insignificant, which is why the title of this series on Ruth is Nothing Insignificant. Who would have thought that this sort of lady named Ruth, living during the time of the judges, would amount to anything? However, as we read Ruth, we recognize how important and valuable of a role she plays in history, not just in Jewish history, but in all of history. So today, God wants you to understand the book of Ruth. So how can we understand the book of Ruth? How many know how we can understand the book of Ruth at this point? Probably about everybody. But there's 3 ways to understand the book of Ruth. Number 1, by understanding the place of the book, by understanding the purpose of the book, and by understanding the theology of the book. Did you get all those, Kalia? The place, the purpose, and the theology of the book of Ruth. I was telling somebody this week, they asked me why I didn't do a 5-minute message this week. Did anybody notice that there was no 5-minute message? Yeah? I told them it's because I had to write an introduction to the book of Ruth this week, and it's like writing a research paper, and it takes a long time. So, this is it's a lot of effort to go through one of these. It's like a research paper. But we're going to go through this by understanding the place of the book. The first idea about the place of the book is the author. Who wrote the book of Ruth? Truly, the author of the book of Ruth is anonymous. We would like to think that maybe it should be the lady Ruth herself, but it is the conclusion of scholars that Ruth probably did not write the book herself. Some of that comes from the inclusion of the name of David in chapter 4. A lot of people in this time didn't live to be a super old age. Not everybody can be as old as me, you know. It's a joke, you can laugh. It's okay. I know we're in church and everything, but you can still laugh. I think God has a sense of humor. That's probably a different sermon. But how would Ruth know that her great-grandson would be David? Unless she lived that long, and I doubt she lived that long. So how would she know that? Which means she probably didn't write it. This leads many to believe that the author may have been Samuel. Samuel is the name often thrown around. Everybody remember Samuel from 1 Samuel? The great prophet. Hannah is his mom. She brought him into the temple when he was a baby. This man, Samuel. Although other potential authors have been offered, but no other evidence exists to suggest that any of these names are the actual author of the book. It is truly anonymous. What about the audience? What about the audience of the book? To whom was the book of Ruth written? The audience of the book of Ruth is not listed or named either. We don't have many clues as to whom this book was intended. However, the most obvious answer would be the Jews, but we can't be much more specific than that. Although the book of Ruth is read annually by Orthodox Jews on the Feast of Pentecost, and you know, Pentecost was not too long ago. The book of Pentecost, or the Feast of Pentecost, according to John W. Reed, he says this about that. This feast commemorates the giving of the law on Mount Sinai and occurs at the time of the beginning of the offering called the first fruits of the harvest. Ruth's betrothal took place during this festive harvest when barley was being winnowed. And as you read the book of Ruth, you read about Boaz doing some winnowing during a harvest. So they read the book of Ruth every year at this time. So is the audience that kind of thing? I don't know, but kind of helps to understand a little bit about the audience of the book of Ruth. Primarily just going to be a Jewish audience. What about the age of the book? Traditionally, it is thought that the book was written by Samuel sometime during the reign of David as a result of his name being mentioned in chapter 4 in the genealogy. Since the name of Solomon is not mentioned, it is believed that this would limit when Ruth would have been written. We would like to think that if Solomon were around, his name would be included in the list in that account as well. But his name's not in the list, so we tend to think that that would be the limit for when Ruth could have been written, sometime during the reign of King David. The setting for the book is during the time of the Judges. Ruth is an account of a family living during the time of the book of Judges, and we get that from chapter 1 and verse 1. It even says that. Now it came to pass in the days when the judges ruled that there was a famine in the land. So during the time of the Judges. So at some point during the book of Judges, we can implant the book of Ruth. Where exactly, it doesn't say, but at some point during the time of the Judges, when you read that book, Ruth is in there somewhere. So that's understanding the place of the book in history, the author, the audience, the age. But what about the purpose of the book? So there's a lot going on here with the purpose of the book. There's some key themes that are going to pop up over and over again in this short 4-chapter book. There's the word hesed, which is a Hebrew word meaning covenant loyalty or kindness. If you go with me to chapter 1 and verse 8, it says this: "And Naomi said to her 2 daughters-in-law, Go return each to her mother's house. The Lord dealt kindly with you." That's the word hesed, this covenant loyalty or kindness. Chapter 2 and verse 20. "Then Naomi said to her daughter-in-law, Blessed be he of the Lord who has not forsaken his kindness." The word hesed, a covenant loyalty or kindness. Chapter 3 and verse 10. "Then he said, Blessed are you of the Lord, my daughter, for you have shown more kindness at the end than the beginning." This idea of covenant loyalty or kindness. Showing a loyalty to somebody else just simply for the fact that you are going to be loyal. This is something that's really lost in our day and age. Have you ever noticed that? Remember when people used to only go to Fairway to do their grocery shopping? Because they were that loyal. I don't know, I forgot last week, so I got to double down today. I'm sorry. People would be very loyal. Are people as loyal these days for their groceries? They're not, are they? They kind of bounce around and hop around. My mom will say, well, I went to Dollar Fresh today because, it's something different. What happened to loyalty, Mom? Throw a guy a bone here. Loyalty. But we don't do that anymore. We just don't. We see people in corporate business places. How often does the average person stay at a particular corporate job anymore? It just seems like a couple of years and they're off somewhere else. They're not loyal to this company anymore. People have no loyalty. It's kind of a term that's lost on us anymore. But back in these days, there was the idea of loyalty. That when you committed yourself to someone or something, you stayed there. You stuck it out. We've kind of lost that in a lot of ways in our culture. This idea of loyalty. And Ruth is all about this loyalty, hesed, covenant loyalty or kindness. And it's going to come up. We shared 3 verses. It's in way more than just 3 verses. If you read Ruth this week for yourself as you prepare your heart and your mind to go through all of Ruth in the coming weeks, try to find all the different places where it says kindness like this. I bet you're going to find more than just these 3. Another key theme, aside from hesed, is the sanctity of the home. How important is it that things fall and things happen in the right way to maintain sanctity of the home, a proper respect for the home? As you read Ruth, try to figure out, is there some sanctity of the home that's being talked about? Is this something that matters to Ruth? Is it something that matters to Boaz? Is it something that matters to Naomi? That the sanctity of their home would be maintained and established. Another key theme is that of responsibility. As you read Ruth, Boaz doesn't have to do much of anything. Did you know that? Boaz doesn't have to do a blessed thing. Because there was one closer to Naomi than Boaz. So why did Boaz do this? Was it Boaz's responsibility? But he takes it anyway, because he thinks that it's right. There's an idea of responsibility that's laid through the whole book. And Boaz personifies this idea of responsibility and taking care of people. And as you read Ruth this week, I want you to try to find all the different places where responsibility, where the groundwork of responsibility has been laid throughout this book. responsibility in doing what is right. Not necessarily because it's easy, not necessarily because you're going to get something out of it. Because a lot of times in our culture, the only reason that we do the things that we do is because of something we're going to get out of it at the end. Well, I'll do this for you if you give me money. I'll do this for you if I get my name out there. What do I get out of the deal? I'm so glad that Boaz didn't say that to Ruth. You know, Ruth, we can do this, but what do I get out of the deal? Aren't you glad Boaz didn't say that? The responsibility that he shows and demonstrates is amazing. It's something we can all learn from. So not only have we seen Hesed, or the sanctity of the home, responsibility, we also see faithfulness. Faithfulness. What I find most interesting about the book of Ruth isn't necessarily the faithfulness of Naomi. It isn't necessarily the faithfulness of Ruth, or even Boaz. You know whose faithfulness I'm most impressed with in the book of Ruth? God's faithfulness. Here we have this Moabite woman. By the way, Moabite, first thing we should have told some Moabite woman is get out of here. You're not an Israelite. What are you doing here? But God demonstrated an unbelievable amount of faithfulness, not only to Naomi, but also to Ruth. And as you read Ruth this week, as you prepare yourself for next week, try to figure out, why is God so faithful to Naomi, Ruth, and Boaz? What would convince God to be so faithful to these people? Another key theme is godliness. Keeping God centered and focused and doing what is right for Him. Another biggie, used 20 times in this 4-chapter book, is the idea of redemption, or the idea of a kinsman redeemer. 20 times in 4 chapters, this idea of redemption or a kinsman redeemer is used. 20 times. That's 5 times on average per chapter. That's a lot of times. Must be important. So what is a kinsman redeemer? And what does this have to do with anything? So a kinsman redeemer is somebody who is close in family, who is going to take over for a deceased brother, his wife. There's a special law in the Old Testament that said if a man's wife, or if a man dies and leaves a wife behind, a brother of the man who died takes the woman for his own wife to have offspring to carry on the name. And this concept, this idea of this kinsman redeemer is used 20 times. Must be important. So as you read Ruth this week, as you prepare your heart and your mind for next week, try to find how many of these 20 you can find of this idea of a kinsman redeemer. Another theme would be family. And how important is family to us as people? Do we put a great deal of emphasis on family? I hope we do. We should. We're supposed to. But as you look out into your world today and you see how much emphasis is placed on family, I don't know about you, but I find it to be rather lackluster. There are some people that do a wonderful job. That's true. But man, it just feels like we could do better as a society. The idea of the family. And finally, we've seen Hesed, the sanctity of the home, responsibility, faithfulness, godliness, redemption, family, and also grace. There's a lot of grace. A lot of grace in this book. A lot of people who got things that didn't deserve them. And I think that speaks to us as well. We as a people don't deserve a lot of things, and yet we have them. By the grace of God, we have them. And the grace of God is very much on display in the book of Ruth. You know, a lot of people like to say that the Old Testament God is different from the New Testament God, as if there's some sort of like two God system out there. You ever heard this before? The God of the Old Testament is all about wrath and the law, and he's mean, but the God of the New Testament is full of joy and love and Jesus. You ever heard this? Am I the only one that's heard this? Apparently. That's okay. I'm okay being the only one. But okay, so let me tell you then, guys, since I'm the only one that knows this, let me tell you, the world out there, a lot of people think like this. They think that the God of the Old Testament is some meanie, and the God of the New Testament is the God of love. Well, I got news for all those people. Not only is it the same God, but as we read through Ruth, we find a lot of love from God. A lot of grace, a lot of mercy, a lot of forgiveness, a lot of really wonderful New Testament truths that we've come to appreciate in the church today that we tend to think of as being overlooked in the Old Testament. The book of Ruth does not overlook them. The book of Ruth is full of grace and life and love and mercy and all kinds of wonderful things like that. So those are some key themes as we try to understand the purpose of the book. But go with me, if you will, to chapter 1, verses 16 and 17. This is the key verse for the book of Ruth. Chapter 1, verses 16 and 17. The key verse for the book of Ruth. Should have done a sword drill to see who was ready. Okay, good. Chapter 1, verses 16 and 17. But Ruth said, "Entreat me not to leave you, or to turn back from following after you. For wherever you go, I will go. And wherever you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God my God. Where you die, I will die, and there will I be buried. The Lord do so to me, and more also, if anything but death parts you and me." I don't know about you, but I get chills just reading that. Ruth is committing herself to Naomi. Ruth is committing herself to the land of Israel. And ultimately, Ruth is committing herself to the God of Israel. And you know what happens when you commit yourself to the God of Israel? You'll never guess. Bet he takes care of you. I bet you find a place of refuge under his wing. If you go to him, I'll betcha. And I suspect that's exactly what Ruth found. This Moabite woman, a foreigner, an outsider, found that to be true because she simply trusted in him. And she followed Naomi back to her homeland of Israel. And here we have the wonderful story of Ruth. What happens to this lady when she trusted in God, the God of Israel? So now let's look at the key structure, the structure of the book. Here's this one outline. As I was studying this and thinking of my own outline, boy, there's got to be about as many outlines as there are people outlining this book. So I'm just going to give you one. If you've got a study Bible, I bet your study Bible is going to have it outlined in a different way that doesn't make one wrong or the other right. It's just different ways of thinking about it. But this particular way, the introduction, verses 1 through 5 of chapter 1. And then number 2, seeking a home by faith, chapter 1, verses 6 through 22. Then number 3, seeking provisions responsibly, chapter 2, verses 1 through 23. And number 4, seeking redeeming love, chapter 3, verses 1 through 18. And then number 5, seeking redemption's loving rewards. Chapter 4, verses 1 through 13. And then a conclusion, chapter 4, verses 14 through 21. Again, that's just one way of handling the outline. There's plenty of different outlines out there. I can't even promise I'm going to use this one as we go through this. Just one way of trying to understand the book. And lastly, understanding the theology of the book. The book of Ruth has some wonderful theology in it. Sometimes we like to think that the Old Testament just doesn't have too much theology to it. There's not a lot of meat there, we like to think. But I've got news for you. Ruth has some wonderful, deep, and rich theology. It is so jam-packed with theology. So let's start to think about this. Bibliology is the study of the Bible. And the book of Ruth has a lot to say about the Bible. There seems to be an understanding of Old Testament laws and structure in the book of Ruth. As you read Ruth, the reason that they're doing so many of the things that they're doing is because they understand some writings of the Old Testament. For example, the Deuteronomic law of the Levirate marriage, where when the wife survives a deceased husband and the brother marries the wife, that's from Old Testament law in the book of Deuteronomy. Well, where did Ruth and Naomi get this? If they didn't believe that the Old Testament was real or true or available, how did they ever get this? They had to get it somewhere. So they must have had something, and they must have believed it. They must have thought it was true. Sometimes I wonder if they believe and knew it more than some of us who have this collecting dust on a bookcase. They didn't have this, and yet they knew it, understood it, and followed it. And this idea of the Levirate marriage is not only in Deuteronomy chapter 25, but it's also in Genesis chapter 38, and Matthew 22. It's also in Mark. We read about that. Remember when the Sadducees came to Jesus to challenge him and ask him a question, and they asked him about the law of Levirate marriage. So, another idea is the importance of Israel belonging to God. At one point, they're going to say that they had heard that God had provided Israel with bread. That's true. How did they know that? You ever wonder how people know things? How did they know that? They had to have read it somewhere or heard it or from somebody that had read it or something. I don't know what their chain of command was, but somehow they got it. And they believed it and they acted upon it as if they believed it was true, because it is true. So that's some bibliology from the book of Ruth. Also, theology proper is a study of God himself. The name of God is used over 20 times in this short book about a non-Jew. Remember, Ruth is not Jewish. She is not from the tribe of any tribe. She's not from the line of Abraham. She's not Jewish. She's no more Jewish than I am. How did this non-Jew end up in the Bible? Interesting, to say the least. The name of God by this non-Jew is used over 20 times in this 4-chapter book. Heavy emphasis on the idea of God and who God is and what God can do. So Christology is a study of Jesus. As we study Ruth further, we bump into this idea of a kinsman redeemer in Boaz. What does this have to do with Jesus? I've told some of you that Ruth is very heavily Christocentric and centers around Jesus. And did you wonder what I meant by that? Like, what does Jesus have to do with Ruth? Anybody pick up on that? Anybody know that?
It's the lineage.
It does have to do with the lineage. Jesus also acts as our kinsman redeemer. Did you realize that? Jesus paid a price for me in order to take me as his own. I had a debt that I couldn't pay. Do you know what that is? Starts with the letter S. Sin. You know, the thing that takes you further than you want to go, costs you more than you want to pay, and keeps you longer than you want to stay. You know that thing, sin? I had a sin debt. A bounty on my name for all of my sin. And I couldn't pay it. There's nothing I can do. I can go to church a lot, that's true. Get some water sprinkled on my head, that's also true. I can do a lot of different things. I can give some money, and that's great. But ultimately, none of it works. None of it gets me anywhere, and it gets me no closer to crossing that gap between me and God. Those things ultimately don't answer any of the problems that we face in this life. Because the problems that we face are not usually the problems that we face. It's kind of an old saying of mine. And the problem that we face isn't a lack of church attendance. And the problem that we face isn't a lack of baptisms. The problems that we face isn't a lack of money. The problems that we face are our sin. Hello, that's our problem. That's the problem. That's the issue that we need to deal with, is our sin. And Jesus comes as our kinsman redeemer to redeem us from the curse of the law. Did he have to do it? No. There was nobody up there in heaven with a gun pointing it at the head of Jesus saying, you need to go down there for those guys and gals down there. No, that didn't happen. Why does he do it then? Out of love, grace, kindness, mercy. You name 100 reasons. But none of them were forced. And as we think about Boaz in claiming Ruth, was there somebody with a gun saying, Boaz, you better... No. Why did he do it? Out of love for Ruth, compassion, kindness, grace, mercy, gentleness. Some really good reasons. And just as Boaz demonstrates to Ruth this idea of a kinsman redeemer and redeeming her from the situation and the predicament that she found herself in, Jesus comes as our kinsman redeemer to reclaim us from the bondage of sin that we are in. It's a parallel in that way. Because remember, what did Ruth do to gain any of this from Boaz? Nothing. Nothing. We'll drop down to anthropology, the study of man. One of the things that I really enjoy about anthropology and studying man and mankind is the genealogy that's always listed. You ever see the genealogies of like 2nd Chronicles or and you're just like, oh, can we just skip this? I'm not reading those names. Why are these genealogies always in there? Why do these Jews always think that it's so vitally important to have all these names none of us can pronounce in these books? Guys, can we just skip this already, please? But for some reason, they keep putting it in there. Why? Why is it so important to these Jews that these names are in here? Because they want to have proof that the lineage that they're talking about is valid. Because so much of what they do is based on ancestry and blood, which is why this law of Levite marriage is so important. If a woman is here and her husband dies, how are they going to have children to maintain the estate? They wouldn't, because there's no heirs. Bloodlines are everything. Who is the rightful heir or owner of this land? Very significant questions. In fact, this level of significance still exists today in the Middle East and other parts of the world. So why are they so bent on knowing the lines and the lineage? Because they want to prove and demonstrate that, yes, this person is the rightful heir of this thing. Whether it's an estate, whether it's the lineage of a priest, whether it's the lineage and line of Jesus. Is Jesus really the heir of David? Well, if we knew his lineage as well as some of us know our lineage, we'd have to say, well, I think so, I hope so, maybe, probably. I know I like to do genealogy things. When Jeanette was here for Christmas one year, she got me an Ancestry DNA kit. And I really liked that. That was really cool. I kind of get into that stuff. And doing a family tree, I think, is really cool. My dad's side of the family has volumes of book bigger than the Bible of going all the way back to like the 1600s, and that's pretty cool. Doesn't really prove anything for me, but it's still neat nevertheless. In Bible times, however, though, when Jesus says that he's the son of David, can you prove it, Jesus, or you just think you are? These lineages, these genealogies prove that he is exactly who he says he is. And if they weren't in the Bible, we'd all be wondering, was he right? Well, he should be right. He's Jesus, but is he right? Yes, he is. He absolutely is. And here you go, right here, black and white, done, proved. Beyond a shadow of a doubt, he is the rightful heir. Let's move on to soteriology, the study of salvation. This is a fun one to study. Laced throughout this book is the idea of salvation through a kinsman redeemer. It was the kinsman redeemer and him alone who saved Ruth, Naomi, their bloodline, and ultimately God used them to produce for all of us the Savior, Jesus Christ, through whom all people of the earth are blessed. And God used this lady, Ruth, this seemingly insignificant book, this insignificant lady, this foreigner, this person who didn't belong in Judea. What is she doing here? And as we read this, all of these little details, we realize that there's nothing insignificant about this book. Let's pray.